thank you for tuning in to the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Podcast, sharing research, progress, and hope. We have an exciting episode today talking about cross-species work. We have two guests, so let's welcome Dr. Benjamin Scott, an assistant professor at Boston University, and Amanda Fath, a graduate student at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, who is working in Guoping Feng's lab. Thank you so much, Ben and Amanda, for being here today.
Thank you, Lauren, for having us.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you for having us.
So before we get started, I do want to give everyone a little bit of background about how I found my way to you. I actually first met Ben when I was working at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and running studies in Fragile X syndrome. I heard about this computer-based cognitive task that you specifically designed for individuals with more significant cognitive impairments and intellectual disability. You were showing your data about kind of how you were able to collect more data from individuals who typically get excluded from studies. So now fast forward a year or so later, I'm now working at the foundation, and I found out you had received an award from Safari to do this work in mice. So now with that background, Ben, can you tell me a little bit more about how you found your way into Phelan-McDermid syndrome, and specifically, you started, I think, studying mice, and now you're designing tasks for individuals with developmental disorders like Phelan-McDermid syndrome.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So I'm a neuroscientist, and I've had a lifelong interest in the relationship between the brain and behavior. And this led me to MIT, where I did a PhD in developmental neuroscience, and then to Princeton as a postdoc, where I studied brain circuits that control decision-making. And all through this process, I'd been studying animal models where we have really good tools to get down precisely to understand the cells and circuits that are controlling behavior. After Princeton, I joined the psychology department here at BU, and there were a lot of researchers who study humans. One of my new colleagues was Helen Tager-Flussberg, who was autism. I invited her to get coffee and chat about research. This was a great conversation and really changed the trajectory of my research. So Helen identified, I'd say, two big problems in the field. The first one is that individuals with more severe forms of neurodevelopmental problems are largely excluded from the sort of precise psychophysical studies that we're interested in doing. And the second one is that the basic science animal work, where we can get to cells and circuits, and the work in humans to study altered cognition and perceptual processing, those two fields don't really overlap enough. So there's a real disconnect between research in both of those communities. So, this conversation was a real eureka moment for me, and Helen and I began a collaboration to do parallel studies in humans and animals, comparing as directly as possible the respective behaviors while they played a simple cross-species game. And that, as you mentioned, that work was funded by the Simons Foundation. And then I met Amanda and her PhD advisor, Guoping Feng, who were studying SHANK3 in animal models. And it's that new collaboration that's really led us down the path to Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So, and I'll let Amanda tell more about how research progressed from there.
I'm a PhD student in the Brain and Cognitive Sciences department at MIT. And I work in Guoping Feng's lab. And so just to give an overview of kind of what our lab does is that we study genetic and brain mechanisms underlying neurodevelopmental disorders, including SHANK3 mutations and deletions, which of course underlie Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And in addition to understanding those mechanisms, Guoping and the lab are deeply committed to developing treatments. So for example, work from our group has laid the foundation for SHANK3 gene therapy program, that's now licensed to Jaguar Gene Therapy and has recently begun its first in-human clinical trials. So there's a really strong translational focus that Guoping emphasizes in the lab. Personally, I've been really interested in how we translate animal research out of the lab into something that really meaningfully helps people. And my work in my thesis has really focused on how neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric disorders alter brain circuits and synapse and ultimately shape how someone perceives and interacts with the world and ultimately makes decisions. But one of the biggest challenges in neurodevelopmental disorders and autism is that sensory symptoms and other symptoms are really qualitatively described. Either a provider or someone else is kind of making this qualitative assessment rather than something that's truly quantitative. And we know these symptoms are real and impactful, but if we don't have good tools to precisely measure them, it becomes really difficult to then model in animals. And so when I was trying to model these in animals, I was trying to think, okay, how can we have this really clear translation from the animal models we're using to an actual human experience? So then I found Ben. And what we're trying to do together is trying to address this gap. And so I was led to Ben's work where I saw that he developed this task for humans and mice that specifically can quantitatively measure how sensory information is processed and integrated over time. And I was like, great, this is perfect. This task is already set up, and we can, like, this is a perfect bridge with the SHANK3 mutation. And then I worked closely with his lab to then adapt this task for non-human primates, specifically marmosets. So then we can measure the exact same process across human, mice, and non-human primates using this shared framework. Another component that's really important about this process is that we have really good understandings of how these computational models that can describe the decision-making process. And we understand what maps onto the brain. And so since we know a lot how these brain circuits support these computations, we can use the task, the computational approaches to kind of bring everything together to understand how this task is being played across species. So we can directly compare the mutations, but also then understand and probe the neural circuits in the animal models to then really understand what's going on in humans. For example, if we see the same kind of change, how sensory information is processed across animals, then we go back, as I was saying, into the animal models and look directly at brain circuits to understand what's going on. Ultimately, the goal is to give us a much clearer path towards identifying targeted treatments.
I really want to emphasize that how amazing this cross species work is. And I think that's something that, Ben was alluding to, but it's really rare in this field of neurodevelopmental disorders to have cross species analogous tasks. So, a similar task that is being done in a rodent model and a human, but now you also have added the non human primate, which is also fairly rare. And so I want to highlight to the community that this doesn't happen. I was lucky enough at my previous job at Cincinnati Children's to be doing analogous tasks across the rodent model as well as humans, but this doesn't happen a lot. There's only a few of us in the world that are really thinking about how do we design a task for humans that can be also done in the mouse. But then also sort of the other way is sometimes you have an existing mouse task or rodent task. And how do we then translate it into the humans? And it's so important, as you pointed out, Amanda, for that just cross translational work, but then eventually things like gene therapy. So before I ask you more questions, I just want to applaud you guys that you are doing what needs to be done kind of in this neurodevelopmental disorder world. But I do want to pause. And so I know some of our families have been able to participate in the task, but can we pause and tell them a little bit about what this game is and what they're doing, just so they can sort of visualize what it looks like when you were talking about it?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the task takes the form of an online video game that's playable on a computer or a tablet. And in this version of the game, you'll experience a field of asteroids. So there's a bunch of different rocks. So you're in space and there's a bunch of different rocks on the screen. You touch an asteroid, and then you're presented with two flashing stimuli that take the form of aliens. And your job is to tap on the right stimuli. I won't tell you which one the right one is because you have to learn that for yourself.
The correct stimuli.
Yes, the correct stimuli. And then once you do that, the asteroid blows up and you get points. And you do that about 200 times, takes about 10 minutes. and a lot of players find it really fun. And I should say that some individuals find it fun, others find it really challenging and can't even complete the study, but that's great. All data is good data. So whether you play for the whole time or, maybe even touching the asteroids a challenge, we can use all that data.
All data is good data is something that I have said many times in my academic career. And I think it's really important to emphasize that to families, and something, it's always good even to sort of like get into the day, is that our families are often used to their loved ones not being able to complete a task and feeling almost like it's a quote unquote failure. And I want to make sure parents realize all data is good data. Going back to a previous question, can you both kind of tell me a little bit about what this cross species works really means to you and why you think it's so important for the field?
I'll start on that one. So, animal studies are incredibly useful for understanding basic biological mechanisms of brain function, both in health and in disease. And, I can just point to so many groundbreaking discoveries made in animal models that have contributed significantly to human health. But I think in some cases, especially when it comes to uh, different types of neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric disorders, there's a real challenge in maximizing the use of these animal models. And I think the best way to maximize them is by really putting them in the context of the human condition. As I mentioned before, the animal work and the human work can proceed along separate parallel lines. But our hope is that the work that we're doing, this project, will help basic researchers in animal models and more patient-oriented clinicians and researchers really speak a common language, and that together we can make discoveries that will impact patients and families.
And just like kind of to go off of that, I completely agree with Ben, um, that we have these great animal models that we need to be able to map onto the human experience. Um, and specifically, unless we have a reliable way to connect those findings to humans, we don't really know if we talk about like the circuit mechanisms and what's going on in the brain exactly. We don't understand then how they map on to that human experience. So then it becomes really hard to predict whether a treatment that works in animals will then actually work in humans. And I think what makes the work that Ben and I are doing so powerful is using the same exact task and having this quantitative framework across species, because it's not only kind of connecting and across species work, it's specifically implementing these computational models that we've brought from basic science work to then connect these circuits and this behavior together. Um, because we're measuring the exact same cognitive process in mice and marmosets and humans. So rather than saying that this looks similar, we actually have a quantitative way to define that. It also allows us to ask different levels of questions in different species. In humans, we can measure behavior very precisely now. And where we were saying earlier that it's mostly been qualitative measures to understand, for example, sensory processing disruption. And then with that, in these animal models, we then are going deeper to examine the brain circuits directly. And with those, when those two levels line up, it makes it really incredibly powerful. This cross species work is a way of connecting the mechanism to the lived experience. And it helps ensure what we're learning in the lab is really relevant to people and their families. And ultimately, it increases the chances that discoveries in these animal models will really translate into meaningful treatment for people.
I think something that is so essential with this type of work, especially cross species work, is making sure, like you said, it sort of maps back onto the lived experience. So, could you explain a little bit about how the task that is, this fun asteroid task is really mapping onto a cognitive concern, a sensory concern that our parents are dealing with?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I would say that one of the surprising things that we found was that, that gameplay in this task, the statistics we can gain from after someone plays the task, that they correlate or track with clinically relevant symptoms. So your community may be familiar with these survey-based metrics like the Vineland Adaptive Behavioral Score, and gameplay from this task maps onto or correlates with those statistics. So individuals with low adaptive ability, according to these surveys, have deficits or difficulties in certain aspects of the game. So the game was originally designed to look at perception, but actually, because it's complex, you have to learn it through reinforcement learning. We're not teaching them the rules. So they have to adapt and kind of come up with strategies and test them out. And so it's actually a very complex game from a data standpoint. There's a lot of different metrics we're getting. And we find that not only do we see individuals with deficits in perception, but we also see deficits in learning, and these map to these clinically relevant symptoms.
This is a task that is, a perceptual based task, but it's really tapping into something that you called reinforcement learning. And so this is sort of a basic foundation for all learning and behavior, really. And we know that is a challenge for individuals across neurodevelopmental disorders, and including Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And so you're able to not only sort of measure some of these basic aspects of learning with this task, but then you're also learning through sort of the analysis after the fact that their performance on this task is tied to some of these broader aspects that we know are impaired in Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And what's important in that, at least in my mind and kind of my prior work, is that sometimes a 10-minute task is a lot easier to do than an hour interview, or a 10-minute task is a lot easier to do than our larger IQ and cognitive based tasks. And so I think, again, this points to how relevant this task is and important. I know, Amanda, you are gonna jump in there, so feel free to add.
No, no worries. I also just wanted to add too, not only does this task map on to what you both were talking about, these other measures that are generally used in neurodevelopmental disorders, but also we're looking at perceptual decision making. And I always say that decision making is life is a series of decisions. And what people might see in their loved ones with neurodevelopmental disorders and Phelan-McDermid syndrome is that the symptoms they see on a day-to-day basis ultimately result in impaired decision making. And an example is crossing the street. For example, you have to take in a lot of different sensory cues to make a decision of when it's best to cross the street. All these kind of day-to-day tasks that we do as a human require processing sensory input and then making a decision. And so we're really kind of taking that lived experience and making it, gamifying it, and making it into this kind of 10-minute assay that we can really capture how that might play out in a real world scenario.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. As we were talking about the lived experience, something I also wanted to circle back on was, have you been able to talk with families about sort of their experience with the game and sort of get any feedback? Have you made any adjustments based on that feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have the game that we're talking about today, which we call Asteroids, because you're destroying asteroids, is the third version of this game that we've developed. And each version of this game we've sort of upgraded to address the challenges that players face in the earlier versions of the game. So a previous game called Geode, because you were collecting gems, was more challenging for people with more severe symptoms to finish and get through and play. Um, and so the upgrades that we've made with the most recent game to address that have been it's faster, it's more fun, it's more engaging. But I think we're still scratching the surface in terms of the possibility and potential for what these games have. And so we'd really look forward to more interactions with families in the future. And I think both Amanda and I are really excited for your family conference as a potential opportunity to do that. Meet people face to face and get some feedback on the game and how it might be even better.
Absolutely. I know in, my own previous work, sort of getting that active feedback was so important in really adjusting, even just like small increments, like you said, about timing of making sure it's not too fast, so that it's really too challenging, but also not too slow that it becomes disengaging. And so I love that you've really listened to families, caregivers, and made adjustments, not just based on maybe data alone, but also hearing from them. And I'm always happy to hear that you're seeking more feedback. I imagine the monkeys and rodents, though, are not giving you that feedback if they would like adjustments.
Unfortunately not. They do love it. I can say from the non-human primates, they love playing it. But that's pretty much what I get.
Yeah. So I also really appreciate that both of you are so excited to come to our family conference in Colorado. And I think it's fairly in the neurodevelopmental community to get basic scientists that are able to interact with individuals with the lived experience. And so, based upon interactions you've had so far, conversations you've had so far, I'd really love to hear from you how this has changed your work and what maybe even advice you'd give to others sort of getting into this rare disease research, making sure that they develop these connections too.
Yeah, I can start with this. As a basic scientist, it's especially someone who spends a lot of time working with animal models, it's really easy for the work to feel very abstract. You're thinking about genes and brain circuits and models and statistics. But when you interact directly with individuals and families, it really changes the context entirely. As like Ben was just describing, it changes how we adapt the game. And it also reminds you that every data point represents a person's lived experience. And to answer your other question of how it's changed my work, it's changed it in two very concrete ways. First, it's really reinforced something that originally drew me to this field, which is the importance of bridging academic discoveries to bringing meaningful outcomes to patients. As Ben had talked about earlier, basic research is essential. It's how we uncover the mechanisms and build the foundation for everything else. But interacting with the community has made this bridge feel much more real and much more urgent too. And it's really deepened my commitment personally to making sure that the work we do in the lab really ultimately connects to improving people's lives. And second, it's really changed the way I think about communication. Um, Before I came into science, I taught high school chemistry, and so scientific communication has always been something that's really important to me. But as scientists, feel strongly that we have an obligation to explain our work clearly and accessibly. And I love that you do this podcast too to bridge that gap too. If people most affected by the research can't understand what we're doing or why it matters, then we're not really doing our job fully. I've become much more intentional about communicating in a way that's transparent and it's understandable and grounded what families really care about. And then lastly, you asked about advice too. And I would definitely say building relationships early and listening first. Rare disease communities are incredibly knowledgeable, and deeply invested. Seeing that investment has been really, truly inspiring. Um, People understand from these communities, they understand the condition in ways researchers simply can't understand from the lab alone, living from their daily lived experience with their loved ones. And when scientists approach the community with humility and openness, it becomes a real partnership. And I think we need to see more of that. And I think a better partnership ultimately leads for better science and more impactful outcomes. And
That's a
I'll let
perfect answer. Thank you. Yeah, let's shout that from the rooftops for everything for everyone. Ben, anything you want to add now that I just told her is the perfect answer?
No, no, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, Amanda and I are at, different, we're different career stages, and yet I would echo everything she said. It feels like interacting with, crossing this bridge and interacting with, patient populations and their families has resonated with us in the same way. And it gives me hope that it will, if others take these similar steps, it will resonate with them as well. And um, so that's all I have to say. Well said, Amanda.
Yeah. Well, and I know it's mostly our, families and loved ones and their loved ones listening and tuning into this podcast, but I'm also hoping maybe we can send it out to a bunch of scientists out there so that they hear that answer because I think what I'm also hearing in addition to you're getting some personal inherent joy out of this is that it really is making your science better, which also makes it more fundable. And I know I hate sort of leaning into that, but funding is really hard right now. And I think there has been in more recent years a greater appreciation for making sure the lived experience is included and accounted for, even in basic science. And so you guys are a great example of like how to make that work. And I hope more basic scientists and scientists out there can really kind of use that model. The only other thing I would add to scientists, if you're in the rare disease community or any patient community, connect with those patient advocacy organizations like ours. We will connect you to the families with the lived experience. We will tell you what you're doing is meaningful and really provide some context for what you're doing and making sure that like you said like you could have the most perfect non-human primate or rodent task, but if it has no relation to the human condition, it doesn't really matter then. And so you guys have really thought about that well. So before we wrap up, tell us a little bit more about sort of where the project is right now, and is there anything our Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation community can do to potentially help?
Yeah, I can take that. So we have, of course, run some people with Phelan-McDermid syndrome on the task, and it's been quite successful. But we definitely right now are doing another stage of recruitment, and so we definitely would love to expand the study and strengthen our understanding of how perceptual decision making is affected with individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So we're currently looking for individuals between the ages of 11 and 21. As Ben described, the task is short. It's a tablet-based game, and the entire session, including explanation and setup ticket, typically takes around 30 minutes to an hour. As Ben also had mentioned earlier, we're also using gameplay statistics and correlating those with some of the surveys that you all might be familiar with, like the Vineland. For the PMS community, the biggest way to help is participating or just helping us spread the word. If you don't know necessarily someone who fits into this criteria for this task, please spread the word through the community because we definitely would like to get as many people as possible to play the task. And to again emphasize what Ben said earlier, every additional participant strengthens our study and brings us closer to understanding how sensory processing and perceptual integration differences map onto brain function and ultimately how we better target treatment. And if you're unsure if you can complete the task, we just really encourage anyone to reach out. We would just love to have a conversation, regardless, and we're just happy to talk through what participation would look like and try to answer any questions you all have. And I will give our contact information to Lauren, or she has it, so you can go through Lauren to contact us.
Absolutely. We will make sure things are in the show notes as well as in our open study page. And two clarification questions on that. One, this is all web-based or telehealth virtual.
Yes, yeah,
Perfect. They don't
thank you
need to
for
come to you,
clarifying
I guess
that.
is more. You are entering their world virtually.
Yes, and that's the one of the reasons why I love this game that Ben's Lab started because it makes it so accessible that now we live in this Zoom world that we can just you can just do it over Zoom. We just have a video, which we get a lot of data from, and also just the gameplay statistics.
That's wonderful. I love to hear that. And then I guess maybe less of a clarification point, but I do want to emphasize to families too is that it, from kind of what I've learned from you guys, is that your task is so much more accessible than most tasks for individuals. So if you're loved one has not been able to participate in some other studies, this is the study for you. It's short and quick and easy. And as Ben said, any data is good data. And so if you are interested in contributing to Phelan-McDermid syndrome research, this is a great way to get involved in the comfort of your own home. So I really encourage families to reach out and again, just have a conversation about what it would look like and if it's worth a try. One last thing I also want to do with this podcast is not just learn about the science that the scientists are doing, but I want to help our families know about the scientists themselves. So, do either of you, could you share some fun facts or maybe a particular interest or a hidden talent?
Sure, I'll go. Outside of the lab, so we're real people. We love doing things outside of the lab. I love cooking and hosting dinner for friends. I'm a huge foodie, so I love just bringing people together over food, just a good meal. And I guess this is not a fun fact, but right now I am also in the middle of planning my wedding, which has been a completely different kind of project management challenge. Also, but it's been a joy. I can't wait. So yeah.
Well, congratulations there. What's one of your like favorite or like best dishes that you create?
Oh my goodness. So my fiance is Spanish, and so we cook a lot of Spanish dishes. One is something called feijoa, which is kind of like a pasta paella type thing. Like they're these little like
Mm,
fideos, like these little and they're great. So that's one of my favorite things to cook. There's so many though, but yeah, that's one of them.
yum. Ben?
Yeah, a little about me. Let's see. I love nature and music. I play the violin and the guitar.
Ooh.
I watched some previous Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation podcasts and realized that Katie Phelan is a huge Boston Celtics fan. And I have to
Yeah.
say, I am also a huge Boston Celtics fan. And then finally, yeah, like Amanda, I've got some big news coming up in my life. So I'm going to be a dad later this month. My wife and I
Congrats.
are expecting our first kid.
That is so wonderful. As our community knows, welcomed my first child about 7 months ago now, which is wild. So happy to talk to you about that after. But yeah, Katie Phelan's podcast, I learned that our colors are green because
Yeah,
of the Boston Celtics, which I love.
yeah, I learned that too. That's so wild. Yeah.
I love that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's such a good fun fact. I want to know more about like all the patient advocacy organizations' colors and how they got there now. So again, thank you so much, Ben and Amanda, for being here today, to sharing your science, to sharing that you're real human beings that have real human exciting news to celebrate. So thank you. And we cannot wait to hear more at our 2026 Family Conference in Aurora, Colorado in July.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for having us.
Thank you.